Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 172, IO 533c. It seems to me that Socrates wants Io himself to ask the question what techne Io has. Socrates doesn't ask for Io, he wants Io to do the work. It doesn't seem to me to be the case that someone who can only talk about one practitioner of a techne but not other practitioners of a techne doesn't have a techne. It isn't the case that someone who possesses a techne needs to know every little detail about not only the techne itself but also all the practitioners of that techne. Indeed, if Io did have the techne which allowed him to talk about the practitioners of that same techne, he would have to have the techne of poetry, but he is not a poet. His techne has to be some other techne. When Io said that he can talk well about Homer but not about other poets, Socrates then asked a series of questions about the same sort of thing in other technai, and Io himself thought that it is not the case that someone with a techne would be unable to talk about all the practitioners of a techne, but only one practitioner of a techne. In other words, he himself thinks that he doesn't have the techne of poetry, which is the techne of the practitioners who he should be able to talk about. Homer is a poet, he has the techne of poetry. Socrates surely tries to wake Io up by asking in his last example whether it is at all possible that someone would be unable to talk about Io. And by analogy with the earlier examples, Io must therefore be a practitioner of a techne, and the person who is unable to talk about Io should have been able to talk about Io had he had the same techne. And Io should have asked himself, what techne is that? What techne do Io have? And it isn't the techne of poetry. But Io simply dismisses the possibility that there is someone who couldn't possibly talk about Io, and he reverts to his original problem that he can talk well about Homer, but not about other poets. And indeed, other people say that Io can talk well about Homer, but not about other poets. Io seems to agree that this means that he doesn't have a techne. He doesn't ask himself what techne. So Socrates has failed in his attempt to make Io think about the type of techne he has, and instead Io wants to know what it is. In other words, what is it that Io has which allows him to speak well about Homer, and only Homer? Instead of correcting his earlier statement that someone who has a techne must know everything about that techne, including all the practitioners of that techne, and this would have been the correct but more complicated thing to do, Socrates plays along with Io and decides to say that Io doesn't have a techne at all, but now he has to invent something else to explain why Io can only talk well about Homer. Kai horo o ion kai elchamaigesoi apophanoumenos homoidoke tutoenai. And I do see Io, in other words, I do see what it is, and I am going to declare to you what this thing seems to me to be. It's interesting that Socrates doesn't use a simple future here. He doesn't say, I shall declare to you, but I am going, the actual verb to go. I'm going as one about to declare to you. And this gives the whole sentence a formal air. It's quite unusual to use the verb to go for a future at this time. It sounds quite natural in modern English, but it wasn't always the case even in English. We should also note that when Socrates says that he's going to show, display, declare what seems to him to be the case, it rarely is what seems to him to be the case. It's something he's invented. He's simply required to say this because of his interlocutor. He can't say what actually is the case because then he won't be doing dialectic. He won't be making his interlocutor think at all dialectically. Anyway, this is what Socrates says. Estigar tuto techne men ukon parasoi perihomeru io legen, honunde elegon. Thea de dynamis he sekine, hosper ente litho hen Euripides men magnetin onomasen, hoide poloi Heraklean. This thing you have talking well about Homer isn't a techne, which is what I was saying just now, but it's a divine power which moves you, just like in the stone which Euripides called magnetis, but which the many call Heraklean. Socrates treats speaking well about Homer as a thing which is somehow on Io's person. In more accurate but bad English, we could say it was at Io. It's not something that Io actually has, it simply is there. Socrates says that speaking well about Homer isn't a techne, but only because he's decided that speaking well about Homer is only part of a larger techne, which would include speaking well about all practitioners of poetry in this case, which is not necessarily true. We could imagine that speaking well about Homer is in itself a techne, and even in this techne it wouldn't be necessary to know every single detail about Homer. A techne is the application of a body of knowledge in a particular subject, and it does not require the technites, the craftsman, to know every single detail about that subject. It's because Io himself has accepted the idea that you have to be able to speak well about all practitioners of the techne that Socrates has to think of an alternative. It isn't techne, so what is it? He says it's a divine power which moves Io. Divine power, thea dynamis. Dynamis is literally the activity of being able, so we could say an ability, and it is divine. In other words, it comes from a god or the gods. And this divine ability is what moves Io. In other words, Io speaks well about Homer, not because he understands what he's doing, not because he has any prior knowledge, but simply because a god or the gods are speaking through him, using his voice, of course. but he is acting like a prophet. So far, so good, but Socrates goes on to say that this is just like in the stone which Euripides called the stone from Magnesia, which is in Thessaly, and that is what we call the magnet. Socrates could have just called it the way the many call it, the stone of Hercules or Heracles. Euripides was the one who called this stone a magnet, effectively, and for that reason we might not ask ourselves why Socrates mentions Euripides. For us, it's useful that he mentioned Euripides. Now we know it's a magnet. But if the many called this stone the stone of Hercules, why mention Euripides? The answer is probably because Euripides is a poet. He wrote tragedies, but he's a poet. This adds nothing to the argument, but it adds authority. We may suppose that hearing the name of Euripides may strengthen this argument for Io. Socrates mentions the magnet because it has in it the divine ability which he now attributes to Io as well. Kaigar haute he lithos, ou monon autustus dactylius age tus siderus, ala kai dynamin entithe sitois dactyliois, host au dunastai tauton tuto poien hoper he lithos, alus agen dactylius, host eniote, hormathos macros panus iderion kai dactylion exalelon ertetai. For this stone not only acts on the rings themselves, the iron ones, but it also transfers the ability to the rings so that they are able to do the same thing, this very same thing as the stone, to act on other rings, so that sometimes quite a long chain of iron pieces, even rings, is made from them connected to each other. So a magnet has a divine power to attract other pieces of iron. They have to be metallic. And these pieces then also acquire the divine power, which allows them to attract even more metallic objects. And the question arises, what is the divine power of Io? How does he affect other people who are like him, just as a magnet is like the other iron pieces? Well, Socrates will be talking for a long time now, so we'll find out next time why Io is so attractive.